Now, back in March 2017, I put out a tweet which coincided with Trump making comments about the state of criminality in Sweden, which was, of course, greatly exacerbated by the migrant crisis, the fact they took in more migrants over that 2-year period than any other European country. I put out a tweet challenging journalists to go and visit, to go and film the no-go zone ghetto areas of Sweden, specifically Malmo, where before that tweet was put out, you had a camera crew from Australia go there and get physically attacked. You had soaring rapes, you had soaring violent crime. Trump pointed it out, his famous last night in Sweden comment. I challenged journalists to go out there. And then there was like an international media smear campaign against yours truly, simply for telling journalists to go and do journalism. Of course, Tim Pool, a couple of weeks later, went out and was kicked out, or at least forced to leave one of these no-go migrant ghettos, proving what I had said. And for the next 2 years, Sweden's violent crime rate has been soaring. Their rape statistics have been getting worse. And finally, 2 years later, 2.5 years later, the mainstream media is finally asking, with the BBC headline, Sweden's 100 explosions this year, what's going on? It took them 2.5 years to ask this question, after having demonized anyone who asked the same question for the past 2.5 years. Article reads, when 3 explosions took place in one night across different parts of Stockholm last month, it came as a shock to residents. There have been blasts in other city suburbs, but never on their doorstep. Swedish police are dealing with unprecedented levels of attacks targeting city centre locations too. The bomb squad was called to deal with 97 explosions in the first 9 months of this year. Now, what they like to do, apart from attack Christian churches, which is happening more and more in Sweden, is attack apartment buildings. This is mostly gang-on-gang violence, but it's gangs concentrated in these no-go ghetto areas. It's second and third generation migrants. So as the category of crime, explosions, was not even logged prior to 2017. Then in 2018, there were 162 explosions, and in the past 2 months alone, the bomb squad have been called to almost 30. Grenade attacks off the charts. We've got shootings off the charts. What otherwise should be a very peaceful, crime-free Sweden. And only at the very end of the article did they actually introduce the idea that this could be related to them bringing in hundreds of thousands of migrants, which exacerbate the problem. But again, they claim that it's just socioeconomics, that it's not the newly arrived migrants, not making the obvious connection that, of course, those newly arrived migrants later go on to become second and third generation migrants. The Spectator was more honest in its article about this. They put out an article, bomb attacks are now a normal part of Swedish life. Again, this is the cultural enrichment, the diversity that Poles are out on the streets marching against. Spectator article makes the point. Normalization is a term that we've come to associate with domestic violence. The victim begins to think of abuse as part of everyday life. That classic frog boiling in the pot idea. Explosions have become so normalized in Sweden that SVT, Sweden's equivalent of the BBC, did not even mention the 3 explosions in the country's capital on its national news program that evening. And in fact, we've covered other stories where left-wing Swedish newspapers will literally send out reporters to harass people who've posted comments online about maybe diversity not being such a strength, to go out, literally bang on their doors and, accuse them of being hateful bigots. So the news, the main news network in Sweden, when they had 3 explosions in their capital city, did not even mention it on that night's news program. Consider that statistics between January and June this year, more than 100 explosions were reported in the country, up from 70 last year. A total of more than 160 suspected attacks with explosives were reported last year. And that went from basically no grenade attacks, no explosive attacks, to 160 a year. The mainstream news is not talking about it. And listen to this. This is what Wilhelm Agrell, professor of intelligence analysis at Lund University, said. He said that the situation has become so dire that the integrity of the Swedish state is in jeopardy. Does that signify to you that diversity is a strength when the problem is so dire, according to this Swedish professor, by no means a right-wing extremist, saying it literally threatens the power monopoly of the state? They're talking about a mini civil war in some areas. The postmen in Sweden can't even go out and deliver packages and parcels in these no-go area ghettos because they get attacked. The fire service gets attacked. They get stones, they get bricks thrown at them if they try to put out fires, because, of course, car fires are another offshoot aspect of this great cultural enrichment program. So Agrell said, quote, the state's monopoly on violence, the actual token of a sovereign government, has been hollowed out bit by bit and no longer exists. The armed criminal violence is having effects that are increasingly similar to those of terrorism. So you actually have a state of low-level urban terrorism, pre-Civil War type scenarios. And again, the statistics show, and we had the one of the big police chiefs in Sweden a couple of years ago come out and say, his name was Peter Springer. He went down the list of suspects in these violent attacks, these explosive attacks, these grenade attacks, and he said virtually every name was an Islamic name. That is the source of the problem. Meanwhile, in Sweden, Swedish teen has ear cut off in brutal gang robbery. An 18-year-old young man had his ear partially or totally cut off by a youth gang who are said to have robbed him of everything except his underwear. And in fact, there was a local government that put out a commercial, a video, advertising for people to come and live in its area, to come and visit its area, comparing their relative tranquility to what's happening in some of these no-go areas, such as Malmo and areas of Stockholm. Of course, for merely putting out an ad that said, let's make Sweden look like Sweden again, they were dragged. They were demonized as racists. Of course, the government's response to all this, despite the Sweden Democrats, the Populist Party, getting into parliament, 18% of the national vote, but the Swedish government's response to the soaring violent crime, to the soaring rape stats, is to take the money from inheritance, which is they've got nobody to pass on to because they've got no relatives who are alive, and give it to fund drag queen story time. That's the Swedish government's response. Absolutely despicable. We'll be back. So we had 150,000 Poles marching on the streets, again, in revolt, in resistance to the globalist agenda, to the cultural imposition that both Islam and the LGBT agenda has had on other European countries. Several more examples of that here, again, exemplifying why those Poles were so energetic, so engaged in marching against this kind of thing. Because in Sweden, we've also had massive problems with the Islamic call to prayer being broadcast on loudspeakers in local areas, and local residents protesting against that, but the government shoving it through. Headline out of Voice of Europe, Netherlands mosques amplified call to prayer silenced by a cut cable. The intensely amplified call to prayer at Amsterdam's Blue Mosque, which was set to be heard for the first time last Friday in the New West district of Amsterdam, was silenced by someone who cut the sound system's cable. Tomorrow, they're just going to do it again. The Blue Mosque was set to be the first mosque in the Dutch capital where the call to prayer broadcast would be amplified over loudspeakers. Dutch daily newspaper De Telegraaf reports. Of course, the reason they're doing that is because they want to turn Amsterdam into Islamabad. Basically, that's what it's all about, occupying the territory. If you can broadcast that out, to where it reaches people half a mile down the road, that then becomes your territory, basically. The controversial plan has faced plenty of resistance from Amsterdam locals who believe the amplification of the call to prayer to ungodly levels is aggressive, unnecessary, obnoxious, and runs counter to Dutch values. Despite this, they went ahead with it anyway because it had been approved by the government and somebody cut the cord, but they're just going to do it again. Geert Wilders, the leader of the National Populist Freedom Party, voiced his feelings about the mosque plan to amplify its call to prayer in a tweet, writing, "Screaming hate palaces must all close. Do it in Saudi Arabia, but not here. This is our country, and Islam does not belong in the Netherlands." But again, it's the local politicians who, by the way, when you look at the stats, none of them live, even the leftists, the Greens, none of them choose to live in the areas with the highest concentration of mosques or anywhere near the so-called no-go zones. Isn't that interesting? Don't really tend to practice what they preach, do they? Meanwhile, in other cultural enrichment news in Germany, Syrian and Afghan asylum seekers attack village disco with machetes. Syrian and Afghan asylum seekers attacked a village disco in a small German village armed with machetes after two were kicked out by a bouncer. This is another one of their favorite things that they seem to like to do. There was a case in Frankfurt when a group of asylum seekers did basically the same thing. You know, a couple of them, what happens, a couple of them will get in the club or in the disco, they'll start harassing women, they'll get kicked out by the bouncers. And then half an hour later, a gang of 20 or 30 of their friends just turn up and start attacking the building with clubs and machetes. We've seen this in numerous European cities over the past 3 years. This incident occurred on Saturday in the village of Trebin in Brandenburg. A group of around 10 migrants attempted to hack down the door to the building with their machetes. The bouncer said the asylum seekers attempted to slash him in the neck, but he was able to fend them off and get inside. And then, of course, they brought their friends and the situation got worse, as they're prone to do. Meanwhile, France is target of more Islamic terror attacks than any other EU state. A new study shows that over half of the terror attacks in the EU occurred in France. They also have massive problems with actual jihadists working in airport security. What could possibly go wrong? Also in France, it's coming up to the 1-year anniversary of the Yellow Vest demonstrations, which of course is part of this theme of the revolt against globalism. Naturally, that's going to die down, and it has over the past few months, but it seems like it's going to be back in bigger numbers than we've seen in recent times. Headline out of Voice of Europe: Yellow Vest planned demonstrations for the protest movement's first birthday. Of course, the origins of that demonstration, that massive protest, that massive uprising, was the globalist imposition on the rural communities in France when they hiked the gas taxes and other taxes related to livestock and farming. That brought the farmers out onto the streets of Paris. Then we saw a similar thing in Holland, with the farmer protests there, because of course they're trying to slash their ability to produce livestock in half, again to satisfy Green New Deal style climate taxes. The massive revolt against globalism, against carbon taxes, is accelerating in virtually every European country. And now the Yellow Vest organizers have called on the French public to gather next Saturday on the Champs-Élysées in Paris. The Champs-Élysées, of course, the site where they banned protests entirely back in March to try and put a cap on this. But on Tuesday, the co-founder of the Yellow Vest Citizens sent a request to hold the new demonstration, the 1-year anniversary demonstration, on the Champs-Élysées, and the authorities are likely to say no. So again, there's going to be another clash between the Yellow Vests and the police likely to happen this weekend. We'll continue to monitor that, but it seems like the Yellow Vests are back as the revolt against globalism across Europe accelerates. Meanwhile, we've had a lot of fake hate crimes, fake racist attacks in the United States. They're also not uncommon across Europe. And we had another one today in Helsinki, Finland. Somali Social Democrat politician faked racist taxi story. This was a Social Democrat Party politician, Abdirahim Hussein, who admitted to making up a hate hoax about a racist passenger in his taxi because he was, quote, angry. The Somalian immigrant and left-wing politician retracted his fictitious account of experiencing racist verbal abuse from a passenger in his taxi after the taxi company found that GPS data from the cab tracker refuted his claims. He apologized for lying. Of course, he'll face no consequences whatsoever, and it's likely that the raft of left-wing politicians and commentators who supported his initial claims will also face no consequences whatsoever. Meanwhile, in Hong Kong, where they're having their own backlash against authoritarianism, headline out of Breitbart: 15-year-old boy hospitalized, 70-year-old man killed in Hong Kong street battles. The 15-year-old boy in Hong Kong is in critical condition after undergoing emergency brain surgery on Wednesday night after a blow to his head, most likely the impact of a tear gas canister fired by the police. And a 70-year-old man died after spending the night in intensive care for a head injury from a brick thrown during a street battle, while a man dressed in black clothing favored by protesters fell to his death under unclear circumstances. Now remember, one of the primary reasons the Hong Kong demonstrators are out on the streets is because of their opposition to mass migration from China. Chinese people can move to Hong Kong, they can immediately get welfare, health benefits. They can become citizens of Hong Kong basically immediately. They introduce their own culture. It clashes with the more westernized Hong Kong culture. And that's why many of those protesters are still out on the streets. And today we have yet another warning that the crackdown, the military Beijing Tiananmen Square style crackdown, could be imminent, because the president of China has remarked, Zero Hedge reports, President Xi wants stopping the storm and restoring order in Hong Kong is China's top priority. He said it was their most urgent task. And basically, a lot of people are asking the question, which has been asked before, is a crackdown imminent? Hong Kong's already gone into recession. I think their GDP was minus 3.2. Tons of money is flooding out of Hong Kong into Singapore. It's no longer becoming a trustworthy place to invest. Of course, the dichotomy is if China rolls in with tanks and enforces a brutal crackdown, Tiananmen Square style, Hong Kong will never probably recover from that, and it will never be a major financial hub ever again. So these are the high stakes we have right now. They rotated troops into Hong Kong. They called it a rotation several months ago. It wasn't a rotation. It was actually beefing up the number of Chinese troops within Hong Kong in preparation for this potential crackdown, which again, some people are now saying could be imminent. Meanwhile, Disney puts outdated cultural depictions trigger warning on old movies, because we had the controversy last week over the John Legend song. He rewrote Baby It's Cold Outside to retract the misogynistic nature of the lyrics. And what's funny about that is he changed all the lyrics to make it look as if, you know, in the song, there's the relationship between the guy and the girl. The girl's saying, oh, I should really go home. He's saying, no, you should stay. It's cold outside. That's, of course, rape culture now in 2019. But they had to change the lyrics of that to such an extent that they changed the entire meaning of the song. So now it looks like the singer, John Legend in this case, is trying to hide his affair from his wife, who's just arrived home, by basically telling her to leave, that she has to leave immediately. So they completely changed the entire premise of the song just to make it woke, and it actually looks even less woke. Well, now Disney's new streaming service has included trigger warnings on old movies that caution the viewer about outdated cultural depictions, again, genuflecting at the altar of political correctness. I was going to wrap it up for the show. War Room with Owen Schroyer is coming up next. Breaking news at summit.news.